You have had a very interesting career progression and you've
Right.
had the opportunity to work in very, very different fields. So, if you were to pick up one key leadership learning in
Yeah.
each one of those stages of your career,
Yeah.
what would those be?
As you can see, I'm chronologically advantaged. My first career was as a Navy pilot. In that career, I learned very early on that the most important thing was to be authentic. Because in the military, if you're a pilot, you're not going to have a wingman unless they trust you. And to let the men and women know that I was privileged to lead, that I was interested in their personal and professional development, that was fundamental. So, in my second career, which was in higher education, I learned the value of listening. And there it was about showing respect to men and women, particularly faculty members who spend 30 years in a business school or a medical school. And there I was responsible for 80,000 faculty and staff, and we had over 400,000 students. The most important thing I did there was I considered myself to be the chief listening officer. Then in my current role at the Center for Creative Leadership and in the business world, I think there you learn the cycle of business language, the sense of urgency, and the importance of not just the long term, but the short term. And it's not either or. They're what we call polarity management, where it's a spectrum between some days you have to be worried about meeting payroll or serving the client, but you have to have this perspective on the long term also. And so it's a constant balancing. You don't let people say you have to focus on the short term or you have to focus on the long term. You have to keep a perspective and manage those polarities.
Tell me more about that, managing, counterbalancing those two polarities.
In higher education, it's all about the long term, And in the military, it can be about the short term or the long terms. But I actually learned in the military that obviously if you have a mission, you have to be focused on that mission, but there's going to be something the next day and the next year and the next year. So in business and the military, there was some similarities. But what you need to be as a leader is don't let one group trap you. Some people have to answer to the shareholders and the stakeholders, and that's every 90 days, whether it's in India or US or London or Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. But you're not going to be around for the long term unless you also continue to focus on the sustainability of your organization. So it's important not to be trapped by particular interest groups, whether it's the people who are buying and selling your stock every day or the people who are investing in the long term. They both have an important role to play in making sure that you handle that context on a long-term basis.
What was the most difficult learning for you when you moved to the business role?
The sense of, margins are important, and you have to maintain margins, and you maintain margins by, not being a commodity, but by being something that offers value to the client. I think the thing that I learned, which is invaluable about the business world, is they are the best people at looking and listening to the client and the customer and saying, what is it that the customer values? I think sometimes when we're in government or in higher education, we forget who the real customer is. We need to understand what the client or the customer values and deliver that in a quality way.
So who were your mentors? If you look back and you kind of identify those people who really created a mark in who you are today, who were they and what did you learn from them?
I would call them not mentors but role models, my parents. They're both deceased now, but for all of my life I watched two people whose words and behavior were matched. My father died first about 6 years ago, and the last word that he spoke was my mother's first name. They're not the people who are on the front page of the Indian Times or the Wall Street Journal, but they're the people who make life go. And so those were the two most important people in my life. I've worked for a number of presidents of the U.S. I've worked for generals and admirals, and you admire and respect them for many reasons. But usually it's because you see that their behavior matches their words. And that's probably the best leadership lesson that I've learned, is that people aren't so interested in what you say, they're interested in what you do. And that's how they judge you, whether you're authentic. And unless you're authentic, you're not really leading anyone. You might be in a position of power where people have to listen, but whether they're engaged, that's another story.